over there. So, good afternoon. Very nice room. Okay, I'm Martin Wolf, and I write for the Financial Times. And it's my great pleasure to moderate this discussion with Francis Frank Fukuyama. As always, I have 2 pages of instructions. Feel like being back at school. So, first of all, are your mobile phones switched off? I don't know what will happen to you if they are switched, if they remain switched on, but it's going to be very, very terrible and humiliating. We would remind you that it's being filmed and live streamed. So there are lots of people tuning in online, whom I welcome. And there's a hashtag, which is, I don't know, how do you know, pound RSAF Fukuyama. And that's for those engaged in Twitter. I don't tweet myself. I regard it as a terrible, terrible, dangerous trap, particularly for people like me, so I avoid it like the plague. My colleagues, unfortunately, are not as wise as I am. Now let's start. I don't really think much introduction is needed for Frank. He is one of the world's most important and influential public intellectuals. I don't think there's any doubt about that. His most celebrated work, still I regret to say, is The End of History and The Last Man, but he's written many incredibly important works since, and this work we're going to discuss today, this thin volume, is the second volume of a 2-volume study. I haven't yet read this book, but I have read the first one, which is, I think, absolutely brilliant, and I think will be of immense importance and rival and in some ways surpass one of the works that I personally think is of the greatest things in this sort of area produced in the last 20 years, S.E. Feiner's History of Government. And if you haven't read, which is even bigger, and it only gets up to 1900, but if you haven't read that, it was his last work, I do recommend that as well. It adds enormously. The way we're going to proceed is he's going to talk for about 20 minutes about the book and what it's about. And then we're going to have a discussion of a couple of themes that come out of it. It's an enormous book. We could discuss many different issues, but we'll focus on a couple of themes. And then you will have the opportunity to ask questions in the last 15 minutes or so. Just to make clear, please think about your questions. They should be questions, not speeches. And as I always like to say, I do know the difference. And I will cut you off because I do rude things like that. And if it's a nice, clear question, which gets a nice, clear answer, it would be very helpful to give more people an opportunity to participate, since we don't have much time. So, Frank, okay. Start off.
Fine, thank you. So thanks very much, Martin. Martin is an old friend of mine. I should plug his book while I'm up here because he's written a really excellent, I mean, there are many books published on the financial crisis, but the one that he published this past month, I think, synthesizes and then goes well beyond what's out there. So if you really want to know what went wrong in 2008 to 2010, that's a great source. So thanks to RSA for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be in London. I will say something about the themes in this book. Probably the best place to start is actually just looking around the contemporary world. So I think the world is bifurcated into 2 broad areas. So honestly, 2014 has been an awful year. We have multiple crises going on, and actually I've not seen the world as unstable as it is right now in quite a lot of time, but the forms of instability are actually quite different. So in one part of the world, it goes from North Africa through sub-Saharan Africa, the Arab world, and into Afghanistan and Pakistan. You have basically, I would say now, a crisis of state authority where simultaneously Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen all have failed central states that cannot keep order. And we've now been dealing with this new body that no one had heard about previously, ISIS, terrorist organization. They look like they're pretty bad people. But I don't believe that, these high testosterone, disaffected kids actually will create a state, except when they can take advantage of the weakness of other states. And the reason that these Islamists have flowed through into places like Mali and northern Nigeria, with Boko Haram and regions like that, is that they don't have governments that can actually provide security for their citizens, and they're filling this kind of a vacuum. The other part of the world is Eurasia, where you have Russia and China at either end that are organized as hierarchical, centralized, bureaucratic states, and they're very powerful, and they're making very traditional kinds of territorial claims against their neighbors. And that actually throws us back into a 19th, 20th century world that's pretty familiar. It doesn't make it easier to deal with, but that produces a kind of interstate conflict that was the kind of staple of earlier generations of diplomats and soldiers. I think the really difficult problem actually has been that weak state world in which state authority doesn't exist, and a great deal of the foreign policy of the United States and Britain and other members of NATO in places like Afghanistan and Iraq has revolved around actually state building, is actually creating the basic institutions of the state. And one thing that we, I think, have very painfully discovered is that the democracy part of a modern state is actually not that hard to put into effect. So we've had democratic elections in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The really hard part is getting to actually a modern state that can deliver services, provide security, and is regarded as legitimate. And that's really the overweening failure, I think, in both of those places in the area where we didn't really understand how to do things. And so this was actually the beginning of this journey for both of the volumes of this book. I describe this problem as the one of getting to Denmark, where Denmark is actually not a real country, but it's an imagined place that is democratic, secure, prosperous, and not corrupt. And we are constantly trying to turn countries like Iraq and Afghanistan into some version of Denmark, and we fail constantly. And I began to realize that the reason that we keep failing at this is that we don't understand how Denmark itself got to be Denmark. And having had a visiting professorship at Aarhus University for some years, I can guarantee you that Danes have no idea how they got to be there either. And so this was the kind of historical journey. So the first volume examines some very distant history, and the second one brings the story up to the present. So I would say that we need to back up a little bit and talk about some basic institutions of government, because this is, the terms of reference for my analysis. In my view, a modern political order really needs to consist of three baskets of institutions that can be possessed in different combinations by different societies. So the first institution is the state. The state is defined by the famous sociologist Max Weber as a monopoly of legitimate force over a certain territory. And this is the essence, I think, of stateness. It is actually coercion. It's the ability to enforce rules by being able to send a police officer with a gun to say, you obey the state's rules or else you go to jail. So it's really about the effective use of power, but it has to be legitimate. And in fact, I think the effective exercise of state authority has to be coupled with legitimacy. And in a way, that's why Iraq and Syria fell apart, is that they had governments that were very coercive, but they were not regarded as broadly legitimate. There's another definition that distinguishes between what Max Weber called a patrimonial state and a modern state. A patrimonial state is one where the ruling elite regards the state as a species of private property to be exploited for their own use or the use of their families. And I would say, and a modern state, by contrast, is one that is impersonal, meaning It treats its citizens with some degree of equality, not depending on whether you're pals with the ruler and the ruling family or whatever, the ruling elite, but simply as a citizen. And I think that this is basically what distinguishes a poor country from a developed country today. It isn't really actually the level of material wealth, since a lot of poor countries like Nigeria can actually get rich from, or certain citizens in those countries can get rich from things like oil. What distinguishes a poor country from a rich country is the ability to have a modern state that treats citizens with some degree of impersonality. And that transition from a highly corrupt, insider-run organization to one that is impersonal is one of the hardest transitions and one of the ones that we understand the least well. All right, so that's one set of institutions. Another set of institutions has to do with the rule of law. Many countries rule through law. I mean, they're basically commands of the ruler, but rule by law means that the ruler himself or herself feels constrained by law. And that's, again, a much harder thing to achieve. If the ruler can make up the rules as they go along, then that's not the rule of law. And therefore, the rule of law, understood in that sense, is one of the most important constraints on power. So the state produces power, but the rule of law constrains power. And then finally, you have institutions of democratic accountability, which are things like free and fair multi-party elections. And again, these are simply procedures that are designed to force the rulers to take into account the interests of the whole population and not just their private interests or the interests of their families. And so what a modern political order consists of is something actually quite contradictory that needs a certain kind of balance. That on the one hand, you need to develop a state that can actually rule and exercise authority, but on the other hand, you need these other institutions of constraint, the rule of law and democratic accountability, to make sure that that power is used in the interest of the public or the majority of the citizens that exist in that country. And that is something that you absolutely cannot take for granted. And you can, in a certain sense, define the spectrum of the world's regimes according to which of these institutions they possess and to what degree. So I would say at one end of the spectrum right now is China, in which you have a very long state tradition of actually a very modern state. This was an argument that I made in the first volume of my book, that Westerners have not acknowledged the fact. So a lot of countries had states early on, like Egypt and Mesopotamia, and Mexico in the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs. But China was really the first country to develop a modern state in the sense of a bureaucratic administration that was merit-based and that sought to treat its large population relatively impersonally. And they did this at the time of the Qin unification in the 3rd century BC. So 1,800 years before any state in Europe got to this level, the Chinese were already doing that. Their problem is they don't have institutions of constraint, so they really don't have anything like a rule of law that constrains the Chinese Communist Party, and of course they don't have democratic accountability. I would actually put a country like the United States at the other end of the spectrum. We do have a strong and very large state that can be very effective at times, but the American founding fathers, in a certain sense, created, they were very, very concerned with tyranny and the abuses of state power. So they created a constitutional system that divided and separated and checked power in multiple ways, such that in the United States, the exercise of concentrated government authority has always been very difficult. And then in between, you've got lots of different mixtures, so you can have a kind of stateless society with democracy, which is something like, Afghanistan, or you can have a society that has a state and the rule of law but no democracy, which is Singapore, and so on and so forth. So there's no guarantee that you're actually going to get all three of these institutions in a successful balance. So as I said, I think that one of the really big issues actually, we Americans especially, are really good at the rule of law and the democratic accountability parts. we run around the world trying to get countries to hold elections, and we have lots of legal advice. We know how to write constitutions and that sort of thing. But the harder issue is really the state building and the getting to this modern good governance kind of state. I'll just give you a few brief examples of why this is important. So what happened in Ukraine over the past decade? In 2004, Ukraine was run by an elected president, a legitimately elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was basically an insider, kleptocrat, who was highly corrupt and ran a very corrupt administration. You had a democratic uprising called the Orange Revolution. They forced a new election, and he was basically removed from power. But the new Orange coalition did not know how to govern. They were themselves corrupt. They did nothing to fix the underlying corruption of the Ukrainian state. They bickered internally, and as a result, Mr. Yanukovych was reelected in 2010 in a free and fair election. And the Euromaidan uprising that took place earlier this year was really about that. It was not so much about democracy as about corruption, because everybody admitted that Yanukovych actually had been democratically elected. The problem was he was running this insider ring that was extracting resources from the Ukrainian state with the help of a bunch of oligarchs and sharing it among himself and his cronies. And the issue about whether you sided with Russia or with the EU for the Ukrainians was entirely about whether you wanted to live under that kind of regime or something like you have in the EU that has impersonal states and a much higher degree of governance and lower levels of corruption and so forth. And I would maintain that in our coming struggle with Russia, again, that's going to be the issue. I mean, nobody contests the fact that Mr. Putin wins democratic elections. So in some sense, the issue is not democracy. The issue is that he too is running a kleptocratic regime that is completely non-transparent in the way that it lives off the state's resources. But the failure goes, I think, deeper to other democratic countries. So in India, there was a study done by Jean Drèze in the late 1990s that showed that in northern India, in some of the poor states, 50% of school teachers were not showing up for work despite the fact that they were being paid. 50%. So this creates a big hue and cry in the country. There's efforts at political reform. 10 years later, they do a similar survey, and they find that the number of school teachers not showing up for work is exactly 50% after 10 years of effort. And, in many respects, this inability to deliver electricity, clean water, basic education, many of these infrastructure, many of these basic services is something that the Indian government, certainly at a national, they're a little bit more successful in certain state governments, but at a national level, it has been a huge struggle. And I think one of the reasons that Narendra Modi was elected prime minister this year was that many Indians are fed up with this, and they want strong government. They want a government that can actually make decisions and move ahead and do things that are necessary to sustain the country's rate of